Hello,
And
everyone,
welcome
and
to
welcome
Duke
to
University's
Duke
live
University's
Google
live
Hangout
Google
with
Hangout with
Nia-Malika
Nia-Malika
Henderson, class of
Henderson, class of
1996.
1996.
Nia is
Nia is
CNN's senior
CNN's
political
senior
reporter,
political
and
reporter,
she joins
and
us
she joins us
live here for this
live here
chat
for this
today.
chat today.
Our Google
Our
Hangout
Google
is part
Hangout
of a
is part of
year-long
a year-long
initiative with Duke
with
University
University
called Campus
called
Stop
Campus Stop
2016. It's an initiative that brings
Initiative that brings
together
together
faculty,
faculty,
students, alumni
students,
to talk
alumni to
about
talk
the
about
presidential election
presidential
and state
election
and
and
local
state
politics.
and local politics.
So we're
So
so
we're
glad to
so
have you here. Yeah, thanks for joining
thanks
us.
for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Great.
Great.
Nia
Nia
has not only
has not only
reported widely for
reported widely for
CNN, but she
CNN,
also
but she
has
also
reported
has
for the
reported
Washington
for the
Post
Washington
and
Post
Newsday,
and
among
Newsday,
others.
among others.
Her
Her
focus
focus
often is
often
on the
is on the
intersection of
intersection of
politics and
and
demographics, race,
demographics,
religion,
race,
and
religion,
gender.
and gender.
All really
All
interesting
really
issues that
interesting
we're seeing
issues that
popping
we're
up
seeing popping
in
up
the
in the
election
election
as we move forward.
as we move forward.
So excited for you to
So
be
excited for
here.
you to be here.
I want to tell
I
our
want to
audience
tell
that
audience
if you
that
have a
if you
question
have a
for Nia
question
today,
so,
simply go to your chat
please go to the
window,
chat
type it
window
in, and I'll
and
be looking through those as
those
I
as
ask
I
Nia
ask
questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get a few of your questions answered as well. All right,
All right.
so we only have
So
about
we
30
only have
minutes,
about
so
30
shall
minutes,
we get
so
started?
shall we get started?
Yes.
Okay,
Let's.
great,
Okay,
very
great,
good.
very good.
So why don't we
So
start
why don't we
with the
start
candidate
with
that
the
is
candidate that is
making headlines
headline
today, Donald Trump.
Donald Trump?
You know, on the
On the
Republican
Republican
side of the
side
race,
of the
we
race,
have
we
this
have this
string of
string of
candidates
candidates
who just seem to be really
seem to be
struggling
really struggling
with
with
closing the gap
closing the
on
gap on
Trump's lead. Do you
Trump.
see
Do you see
Trump
Trump
continuing to stay
continuing to
at the
stay
top of the
at the top
polls?
of the
And
polls? And
if the
if
Republican
the
candidates
Republican candidate
want to
wants
close that gap, what do they
that,
need
what do they
to do?
I think there are two strategies in terms of Donald Trump. One is who emerges as sort of Trump light, as a sort of less bombastic, divisive version of Donald Trump, maybe more of someone who has more of an establishment credentials, somebody like Ted Cruz. So that, I mean, I think that's one strategy you see him trying to employ now. For instance, he doesn't agree with Donald Trump's ideas about what should happen with Muslims coming into the country, and he vaguely criticized him recently at a private fundraiser. And the other is just the complete anti-Trump, right? Somebody like Jeb Bush, somebody like Chris Christie, somebody like all of those folks who are below 4% in the national polls. I mean, that's the real surprising thing here. Jeb Bush enters this race in Washington. Everybody thought he was going to do so well. He raised $100 million, and he just hasn't been able to catch on as the anti-Trump. And maybe someone who's between the Trump light and the anti-Trump is someone like Marco Rubio. Everybody likes to talk about Marco Rubio, and supposedly he's had something of a surge because he's been so great in those debates. The problem is, if you look at two things, one of which is his standing in the polls, it hasn't really improved that much. A state like New Hampshire, it's actually down from October. He's lost 2 points in that poll. And if you just look at organization state by state, he doesn't really have much of an organization. I think his theory of the case is he'll win some state early on and emerge as the consensus choice, and then all the money and infrastructure will come. This sort of idea that if you just kind of do well, then everything else will follow. But the problem is the real approach that somebody like Barack Obama has was, if you build it, they'll come, right? You build your infrastructure, you're smart on social media. And so I think that's the real gap in terms of Marco Rubio's strategy. It's just so hard to think that he's going to catch on in a state and then catch on across the nation in terms of that infrastructure.
Great. What are you hearing from Democrats as they are watching what's unfolding in the Republican race?
In some ways, glee, right? I mean, they In some ways, they think the situation that Republicans are in now is this manifestation of where Republicans have been over the last 4 years, even 8 years, or even 12 to 15 years, which is consistently moving to the right. And in some ways, playing with fire with some of the more divisive talk around immigration reform, particularly over these last cycles, and that Donald Trump is sort of a manifestation of all of this. If in some ways Republicans use kind of dog whistle politics to stoke white fear and white grievance politics and identity politics, then in some ways Donald Trump is using the regular whistle, right? He's not hiding some of this rhetoric that very much resonates with a certain segment of the Republican Party, mainly working class whites. But the thing is, he also does pretty well among college educated Republicans and the Chamber of Commerce types. So I think they are, kind of sitting back and eating popcorn over this one, and seeing that, their interpretations is this is kind of a chickens coming home to roost situation. But also, they say in some ways, and I know Hillary Clinton was on air last night talking about this, they also feel like it's dangerous in some ways, kind of the feelings that it's stoking between, among some people, that this kind of divisive talk just isn't good for the country. And you've heard Republicans say that too.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I think very interesting. Interesting. This was this moment where you got more people in the Republican, decrying. So it seems like it was the first time that you really saw that.
Right.
In the last two election cycles, the candidates who were leading in the polls in December were not the candidates who ultimately, got the nomination. And, I'm thinking of your writing recently on Jeb Bush, who is at 3% and falling, but he has publicly said he's going to make a comeback. Who are the candidates do you think can course correct and perhaps become front runners as the months move forward?
It's anybody's game, I think, to a certain extent, but I think it's really hard to make the case for Jeb Bush because he is cratering. He was at about 15% in this summer, second to Donald Trump. Now he's at 3%. The problem I think he has is he's tried everything, right? He spent $50 million on ads in early states. He said he could fix it. He thought one of his ways to appeal to folks was to talk about his ties to Latinos, and none of that's really worked. And of course, he also just isn't very good debater. He's also just not a very good politician, right? He's not good at the great, kind of big speech. He's not good on the debate stage. He's not good at the kind of retail backslapping that a lot of politicians excel at, like Chris Christie. So I would, I think it's going to be hard for Jeb Bush. I think somebody like Chris Christie looks really great. He's I think he's probably the best all-around politician in this race, and certainly is making a bit of a comeback in New Hampshire. I think he's got a good chance. And then you just look, there's some of these folks who are just at 3 to 1%. Somebody like Kasich, Rand Paul was supposed to have a breakout moment, but I think this focus on national security has really made that hard. So I think, Chris Christie is going to be really interesting to look at, particularly for when he comes out of New Hampshire, if he's able to have a decent showing there.
I have a question here from Keith in Durham. He asks, do you foresee big changes in the polls once the primaries actually begin?
Lines, people don't want to talk to pollsters. So sure, they could change, as you said, Christina. I believe, in December of 2011, I remember very well, Newt Gingrich was leading in the polls, and this was on December 1st, 2011, he came out and said, listen, it's pretty clear that I'm going to be the nominee. I'm leading in all the polls. Of course I'm going to be the nominee, and that's a similar language that you see from Donald Trump. to 2004, you had Howard Dean leading John Kerry. And really, in the 2 weeks before Iowa, John Kerry was able to come back and beat Howard Dean. And we know what obviously happened to Howard Dean. Didn't win. John Kerry did win the nomination, of course, didn't win the presidency. So anything can happen. And even with these external events, right? Who expected Paris? Who expected that horrible shooting in California? And in some ways, that's shaken up the race, shaken up what people want to talk about in terms of making their case to the party.
Hmm. That must be exciting. That must be exciting. I mean, what's that like as a reporter who can see these like shakeups happen?
Yeah, it's great. This is my third campaign because I did 2008, 2012, and 2016. I did a little bit in 2004, but yeah, this is great. I didn't go to school for this as an undergraduate at Duke. I was an anthropology major, but in some ways, campaigns are about culture. It's about the stories we like to tell about ourselves. It's about how we're experiencing cultural moments and historical moments and whatever narratives about the culture and the time and the place and the moment we like to tell ourselves. And of course, that depends on who we are. So it's great. And this is my first time, obviously, working at a television station. I was at newspapers before, but I'm able to write and be on television, which is a really great hybrid. It really speaks to the convergence of media, and so it's been really great so far. And it's only going to get more busy once the real campaign starts in 2016.
That's great. And something that our audience may not know about you was that you were a cultural anthropology major at Duke, and so just that love of storytelling has become a part of you at Duke, but also it led you into journalism. I think that's really incredible.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true. And so I did. I was an anthropology major at Duke and loved that. I mean, my freshman year, I decided to major in anthropology, and I feel like that major kind of helps me understand the moment better, understand culture, understand people, and the stories they like to tell about themselves. So it's been a real good mix for me. I never would have thought I would have ended up doing journalism as an anthropology major, but here I am.
Wonderful. I've got a question from Michael in Durham. Just lost my chat screen. You mentioned that Marco Rubio doesn't have the kind of state-level organization that people have thought is necessary to mount a serious challenge. Who does have that kind of organization at this point in the race, do you think?
Funny thing is, Jeb Bush, because he's got so much money, has got better state organizations. He's doing the kind of groundwork in a place like New Hampshire, for instance, in a place like South Carolina. People think that Marco Rubio will do well in Nevada, partly because there's a big Mormon population in Nevada, and Marco Rubio, of course, was Mormon at some point. So they think he'll do well there. But of course, the thing about Nevada is it's a caucus, and it's kind of hard to organize. Trump doesn't have that great of organization, but he's got the bombast, and he's got the ability to dominate the news cycle, and partly that's due to our willingness to put him on our air because viewers like to see him. Ben Carson has a decent organization in Iowa. I think it's kind of a state-to-state contest. Do people, and then I think Ted Cruz has got great organization in Iowa, but also in these southern states that are going to make up that SEC primary come March 1st. I mean, the thing about this, people have got money. They've got time, they've got opportunity because of the way this thing is structured. It's very front-loaded, it's proportional allocation of delegates. I mean, some of this stuff gets in the weeds, but this is why you hear people talking about that brokered convention.
Let's go back to something that you mentioned. You mentioned the media's willingness to put Donald Trump on the air. How well do you think reporters are doing in keeping candidates, not only Donald Trump, but all of the candidates, on the significant issues? And do you think the news media could be doing more?
Sure, we could be doing more. I think the news media is so broad, right? It's not just CNN, it's not just the the big papers or the big networks anymore. It's everywhere, and it's everything you want to hear and read about. So if you want to dig into uh, Donald Trump's tax policy, such as it is, you can do that. You can go on Vox, you can go on Wonk Blog. We've written about it at CNN Money. I think because there's just an endless, appetite, but also just bandwidth for this stuff. It's not like you only have the morning paper, or you only have the 30-minute broadcast on NBC News. So I think we're doing a pretty good job. I know we've taken a lot of criticism and a lot of heat for almost blame for the Donald Trump phenomena, but people want to hear from Donald Trump, and we put him on our air.
Okay.
Okay. Oh wait, I can't hear. Wait, I can't hear
Oh,
you.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Let's go to the Democratic side of the race. Polls are showing that Hillary Clinton is still leading by, 20 points over Bernie Sanders. I'm curious what you think, Bernie Sanders is, uh, how does having Bernie Sanders in the race affect how Hillary Clinton is shaping and managing her campaign?
Uh, Listen, I think he has definitely shaped where the race is going, but I just also think the nature of the soon-to-be post-Obama Democratic Party has shaped the race as well. She was on a very different side of a lot of these issues in 2008, but Obama was too, and the party has become much more progressive in these last 8 years and embracing some of the identity politics, whether it's like Black Lives Matter or criminal justice reform. The push for same-sex marriage, that wasn't happening in 2008. I do think you can tell in certain very specific ways Clinton has been pushed to the left by Bernie Sanders. Her coming out against the TPP, that was clearly about Bernie Sanders, and wrapping up union and big labor support, which she's been able to do. I think the problem with Bernie Sanders is he himself wasn't as familiar with the Democratic Party as he should have been, and I'm already speaking about him in the past, and I shouldn't, but he has kind of, I think, plateaued at about 30% in some of these polls. But he didn't realize himself how diverse the party was, so he himself has come to a lot of these issues around identity politics, around criminal justice reform, are really, really late. And really, I think that has been to his detriment because he's very much playing catch up on these issues, whereas Clinton has some fluency in them because she ran in 2008 and because a lot of her husband's constituency was that kind of new Democratic Party where African Americans and Latinos are really the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excuse me. You know, Speaking of like the identity politics that you cover, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights issues and discussions are becoming a part of that discussion. And I'm curious, how you feel considering the national context of the protests at the University of Missouri or the Chicago police shooting of Laquan McDonald. How are those civil rights issues shaping some of the campaigns?
Well, I think one of the things you see almost immediately from the Clinton campaign and Sanders campaign and O'Malley. We didn't talk about O'Malley, I guess, because he's only at 1% in the polls. But they immediately have to embrace these issues and these causes. Hillary Clinton right away was tweeting about what had happened at Missouri, standing on the side of students. One of her top campaign advisors is from Missouri. He was tweeting about it. She retweeted it. I think it's been challenging. I think probably more challenging for Bernie Sanders to figure out what Black Lives Matter is all about because he's from a very white state in Vermont. Hillary Clinton has had her own troubles when she went down to Atlanta. The Black Lives Matter protesters, very much shouting her down, and she had the old guard there, right? People like John Lewis, people like Qasim Reed, who are part of the civil rights kind of establishment and official establishment, kind of had her back. But there is this new, very unpredictable, rambunctious crowd, like most social justice movements are, very much pressing these candidates to talk about these issues, to embrace these issues. I think the issue in Chicago with Rahm Emanuel and Laquan McDonald, very, very difficult, not only for Obama. We, of course, remember that Rahm Emanuel was Obama's chief of staff and very tight with the Clintons as well, which is why he was Obama's chief of staff, because he's just a figure in the Democratic Party. You see the protesters there. They are calling for his removal, his resignation. Rahm being Rahm, he'll probably not do that. But Hillary Clinton has essentially come out and said, listen, they feel like that they feel confident that this is something that Rahm can handle, that he can regain the trust of the people there. But again, this puts her on a different side than where those protesters are. And I was talking to her people yesterday. I was like, this seems like an untenable situation for her at this point. They point out, well, she's been a little tough because she was first to say that there needed to be a DOJ investigation, and then you saw Rahm come out later. But that's going to be really interesting to watch, to see what happens out of Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and many of these, the people involved in these discussions, are young voters. Are there ways you think that the candidates can reach out to young voters and speak to them in more meaningful ways?
I think all of these folks are certainly trying. They're trying to do it on social media. They're trying to do it on Twitter. They're trying to do it on Facebook. I think what the situation you have, particularly I think with somebody like Hillary Clinton, and the Black Lives Matter movement and just young people in general, is I do think there is a degree of disappointment with where folks ended up with Obama. Obama was very much a youth movement. He was this cool guy. He had the posters. He was on the cover of Vibe. And then you fast forward 7 years, and it's sort of like, well, what did it get us in some ways? And he certainly didn't necessarily want to embrace a lot of these issues very strongly in his first term. He's picked up some of them in his last term, in these last months. So I think it's a real challenge because you had this candidate in Obama who was cool, right? And it was hip and it was trendy to be an Obama supporter. And now you have these other candidates who are trying to reach out in a similar way to these voters. And we all know that when you try to be cool and you try to reach out to people, especially when you're older, it doesn't work out very well, right? Trying to be cool is the first sign that you're not very cool. But they're very much trying, and Clinton, I know, has hired a lot of younger folks who are very in tune with what goes on Twitter, and they're going back and forth with a lot of the folks on Twitter. So it's very much an effort that she's making, and they go on. I think she was on Seth Meyers recently, and then on the flip side with Republicans, Republicans obviously always struggled to connect with young folks, and I think the person who's trying to do it most of all is Marco Rubio, just by saying, flashing that $1 million smile. He's had videos where he's like tossing a football, talking about hip hop, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, you see like more focus on social media or new media or kind of creative communications like that out of these non-traditional candidates?
Absolutely. Donald Trump is the king of Twitter, right? I mean, he responds on Twitter. He can set a whole news cycle just with a single tweet, and then you have other candidates, responding to him in kind or not so in kind. And then somebody like Ben Carson has really mastered Facebook. He has 5 to 6 million folks who follow him on Facebook. He posts a lot of his messages straight to his followers there. That's a very different crowd than the folks who are on Twitter. They tend to be, he's got a crowd, a lot of women, a lot of homeschoolers. They very much feel an attachment to him and feel like, his messages can go right into the bloodstream by posting on Facebook, and in that way they can go around traditional media as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Very good.
How I was just looking at the Q&A. We've got a question from Dom in Durham, and related to these social media and new ways of communicating. Let's just throw it back on you. Like, can you speak more about the convergence of new media and where you see things going for digital storytellers? And what are some of the trends that you're keeping your eye on as a political reporter? How are you, you know, using all of the excitement of the campaign and all of the issues to get your message to your viewers?
Well, the funny thing, CNN, a lot of us tweet a bunch. I used to be at the Washington Post, a lot of tweeting there. But Twitter can be a little dangerous. I know some of the powers that be here, some of them really push for us to tweet. Others say, listen, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it, because it can be dangerous. People have gotten fired over tweets. And so, but I try to use it as much as I can. I'm off and on with it. I post my stories to Facebook. I think every election it's like some new technology. It's the television election. It's the Twitter election. It's the Facebook election. Maybe this time it's the Facebook election or the Twitter election. I think people thought it was going to be the Meerkat election at some point, and then Meerkat kind of collapsed. But at CNN, we're obviously we've really ramped up our digital coverage and trying to how do you merge the television platform with the digital platform. People are getting most of their news on their phones, particularly young people. So yeah, I mean, I am not the most digitally savvy or tech savvy person, but I do try to have a presence on social media, sometimes just as a lurker.
If our audience wants to tell you, your Twitter handle is at Nia CNN. So you can follow all of Nia's reporting and her blogs. I've got I'm combining a question from Keith from Durham and Jeff from Washington D.C. As you're thinking about how you're covering the elections and what format your stories take, and who you cover. Are there big arguments at CNN and the newsroom, with reporters trying to decide, like, who to cover and how much time to give to those candidates?
That's really that's really different about this campaign is that there's so many candidates, right? And so there are times when it's like, okay, Ben Carson is high in the poll, so my editor will come over and say, listen, we want you to focus on Ben Carson now because he's hot and he's at 26% in the polls. 2 weeks ago, as Ben Carson was cratering in the polls, my editor came over and said, listen, maybe you should focus on Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz because they're up and coming. So, this has been like no other cycle because there's so many candidates. You've got to figure out who should you cover. I wrote a story about Jeb Bush last week when he was at 3% in the polls. And it was, in some ways I've talked to my editors about maybe we should just write one final story on some of these candidates that sort of buries them, right? Because they're, some of these candidates are so low in the polls, but then something else happens. Maybe Jeb Bush will have a breakout moment in the debate. Maybe he'll have some shakeup in his campaign. Maybe the much heralded potential of Marco Rubio doesn't really materialize. So, there are not many arguments. They're kind of discussions face to face with your editor. Maybe you go back and you talk to your reporter friends and you say, "Oh God, my editor," But we're churning out so many stories that in a lot of ways it's best just to say, okay, this is the focus today. If that changes, 2 or 3 days from now, that's fine. And I think the expectation is that you're very familiar, pretty deeply familiar with any number of these candidates and prepared to write something pretty quickly on any given day about any of them.
Well, that's certainly what keeps it exciting for all of us, and watching for who's going to to become the front runner or who's going to fall behind. And it's been great to have your commentary and your expertise today, Nia. It's right at 3:30, so I think we're going to wrap up. But one final question: who do you think is going to drop out first?
Who do I, on the Republican side, I hate to make predictions, so maybe I'll just say Pataki because he's barely in this race to begin with. But this thing is going to go for a while. People are going to see opportunities because they've got so much money, and the way this thing is structured is that you could go into the convention and have people, essentially tied. And so that's why there, again, like I said, there's a talk of the brokered convention. So stay tuned.
Okay, very good.
Okay, very good.
Well, we really appreciate you tuning in to talk about the 2016 presidential election. It's great to have your voice and your expertise. Again, thanks to everyone who tuned in today. This chat is part of the Duke Campaign Stop 2016. You can follow us online and continue to get great chats, interviews, and stories from our wonderful alumni, faculty, and students. So Nia, we'll keep up with you, everyone. You can keep up with Nia on Twitter at NiaCNN. And again, we thank you so much.
Thank you. You guys take care.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, sounds good.
All righty. Bye-bye.